Talk, I'm Eun Cho. Presidents Trump and Moon met in Washington and discussed the next steps of nuclear diplomacy with North Korea. President Trump emphasized he remains focused on the big deal and sanctions will remain in place. How will the latest summit impact North Korea's decision?
We want sanctions to remain in place, but I think that sanctions are right now at a level that's a fair level.
북한의 완전한 비핵화의 최종적인 상태, 그 비핵화의 목표에 대해서 완벽하게 동일한 생각을 가지고 있고
In the studio with me today, Mr. Dennis Wilder, professor at the Georgetown University. Mr. Wilder was Senior Director for East Asian Affairs at the National Security Council during the administration of President George W. Bush and spent more than 3 decades at the CIA. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Now, Professor Wilder, what was the biggest takeaway from the latest summit between Presidents Moon and Trump?
Well, I think that this was an important summit. I think that the South Korean leader wanted to come here and get some advice from the president on how to proceed in talking with the North Koreans, looking at what the next steps in the negotiations might be. I think the President Trump gave him good advice on where the United States is and the kind of message to take to the North Koreans. So in some ways, South Korea right now is playing a very important intermediary role in these negotiations. And given the fact that the North Koreans do not seem to want to talk to the United States at the lower levels at this moment, the role of President Moon is, I think, quite crucial.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would agree that South Korea's role is really coming out. I think that both sides agreed on the objective of complete denuclearization. I think that they affirmed diplomacy as the means by which to continue to pursue it. And also, I think that both sides agreed that there is going to be a high bar that Kim Jong-un has to come up to, rather than trying to lower the bar in order to appease Kim Jong-un and possibly open a way to an incomplete denuclearization pathway.
Mm-hmm. And South Korea wanted partial sanctions easing in the form of inter-Korean economic projects like projects at Kaesong Industrial Complex and tours to Mount Kumgang. And to that, President Trump said now is not the right time.
Right.
Was this widely expected, this kind of reaction?
Well, I think on the South Korean side, President Moon, obviously after a year of intense diplomacy, is getting a little frustrated that there's been no forward movement. So if I might, my own view is he's grasping a little at straws to try and find a way to get the process restarted. He thinks that by allowing a few sanctions reliefs, that might help the process. I think the American perspective is quite different. I think the American perspective is that Kim overplayed his hand in Hanoi and that the pressure needs to be maintained on the North Koreans in order that Kim understand that he can't lowball us in some sort of negotiation. And so the perspectives are very different. I think Moon was not surprised to hear where the administration is. I think the administration's been very clear with where it is, but he probably goes home a bit disappointed that he wasn't able to move the president on this issue.
And President Trump actually said we're talking about humanitarian things. So does this mean the U.S. may give green light to some South Korea's humanitarian aid to North Korea?
Yeah, I would anticipate that there might be some concession on humanitarian aid to North Korea in some form. That's very small in terms of, I think, what South Korea might have been looking for with regard to sanctions relief. But it affirms that the United States is going to hold fast to the perceived leverage that it has on sanctions. And it gives a little bit of leeway for President Moon to go to Kim Jong-un and talk about what has to be done. But really, the pressure is on Kim to come up to the bar that the U.S. and South Korea have set on complete denuclearization. And I think this sends a signal to Kim Jong-un that really there's not much leeway in terms of sanctions relief. And certainly there's not leeway for sanctions repeal at this time. Maybe under the right circumstances, we could see sanctions exemptions, but really the first priority is for North Korea to understand that it has to embrace a pathway to complete denuclearization, really as a prerequisite for expecting that there's going to be sanctions relief in any major form.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Wilder, you were at the National Security Council during the Bush administration. And this summit, President Trump and President Moon, their alone time time was only 2 minutes. How should we read this?
Certainly, if the United States side decided not to give President Moon much time alone with the president, it's an indication that they didn't want President Moon to press on the kinds of issues we've been talking about with the president, and the president having to, on a one-on-one setting, tell the South Korean president difficult things. So in some ways, they were probably protecting President Moon from hearing things that he didn't really want to hear from President Trump in the private setting. And obviously, once you say those, even though it's said in the private settings, it tends to leak out what's discussed. So oftentimes we would find that limiting the private time between the presidents was a good thing to do when you knew that the other leader was going to come in with demands that just simply couldn't be met.
Another gap we saw was that President Trump emphasized that this is the time for big deal. Whereas prior to the summit, South Korean officials floated the ideas of early harvest and good enough deals. So how do we see the gap between the two sides?
Well, I don't think South Korea got very far at this time in terms of putting forward any kind of lesser deal. But what we did see is President Trump talking about step by step, which my impression is that had become kind of a dirty word post-Hanoi among lower level administration officials. And yet President Trump clearly embraced the idea of a process that might involve more than just one bite at the apple in terms of trying to get complete denuclearization. But I think that it's premised on the idea that Kim Jong-un actually commits to complete denuclearization on the front end, and then the pathway or process of implementation may come in several phases.
President Trump did mention step by step, but 3 out of the 4 times that he mentioned was when he was talking about potential meeting with Chairman Kim. So it wasn't about step-by-step denuclearization. So I think the emphasis should be more on the fact that he emphasized that this is the time for the big deal.
Well, I think that President Trump, what he has done is to continue to suggest that diplomatic channels are open with North Korea. But yes, right now, he said he's focused on the big deal. He did not foreclose the possibility that the U.S. position might change under certain circumstances. But it's very clear that President Trump and the U.S. government wants to see what an alternative deal would be like. It puts the onus on North Korea to put something new forward that the U.S. can then examine and judge whether it meets the standard that will lead us to complete denuclearization.
And Professor Wilder, President Moon said that South Korea is absolutely on the same page when it comes to the end state of complete denuclearization. Then what about the process leading up to the complete denuclearization? What does it say about U.S.-South Korea bilateral coordination?
Well, I've been in this game of U.S.-South Korea bilateral coordination for many decades. Our perspectives are different on the Korean Peninsula. Obviously, when you live with a dangerous enemy at your doorstep, you tend to be more eager to have quicker processes and quicker progress, whereas we can take a bit of a more dispassionate view of the situation. It's the South Korean #1 priority. I regret to say that, on the U.S. side, it is one of many priorities. Consequently, we will always have this tension in the relationship. You cannot ameliorate this tension. It will always be part of the picture. The best thing to do, though, is to be candid about those differences, to discuss those differences, and work to make sure that we coordinate closely. And I think that's the value of a summit like this, is keeping those lines of communication open, because you're going to have differences. This cannot be done without some friction in the U.S.-South Korea relationship. You just want to make sure that friction does not break into conflict.
And North Korea, in its Supreme People's Assembly and prior meetings, said that it will withstand sanctions pressures with its self-reliance policy, but didn't mention anything about the new path that we're all worried about. So what do you think is North Korea's strategy right now?
Well, right now in the Supreme People's Assembly, my view is that the message was that they were hunkering down, but we did not see any changes in Kim Jong-un's diplomatic team. And so I think that there may be continued emphasis on international diplomacy. And actually, the biggest challenge that Kim Jong-un has is that he came away from Hanoi looking weak. And so he needs to find a way to recover the idea that he's coming at negotiations from a position of strength. And I actually think that one of the potential benefits of an outreach by President Moon to Chairman Kim is that it provides an opportunity for Chairman Kim not to look like he's coming begging back to the table because Moon is reaching out to Kim to re-engage in the process.
And Professor Wilder, North Korea didn't revert immediately back to provocations. Why do you think is that?
I think they thought about it, and frankly, I think some of the satellite imagery that we saw certainly gave an indication that they were thinking about this. My understanding is that the Chinese may have played some role in this, that they need a calm environment on the peninsula right now. They are very engaged, obviously, in these very important trade talks with the United States, and that they can't afford to have Kim create a crisis on the peninsula at this moment. So I do wonder whether the Chinese stepped in and told Kim that this is not one of the options that you can pursue at this moment.
And Mr. Snyder, President Moon told President Trump that he's going to hold an inter-Korean summit soon. So what is now expected of President Moon, and will he be able to deliver some results?
Well, President Moon's first task is to get Chairman Kim to agree to have a summit. And I think that I'm sure that the North Koreans are assessing the result of the Trump-Moon summit and trying to make a determination as to whether or not that's the right next step for them to take. But then, after a meeting, I think it's pretty clear that Chairman Kim is going to be under greater pressure than he might have anticipated because of the message that is coming out of the Trump-Moon summit. And so I think that it's going to be very complicated and interesting, because I think that one aspect of this engagement may be to distinguish whether or not the problems between the U.S. and North Korea are related to process or related to substance. But if we discover that the problems are related to substance, then President Moon will have contributed to revealing the substantive gap between the U.S. and North Korea rather than contributing to closing that gap.
And Professor Wilder, on a closing note, so U.S. position is clear, and this will be what will be delivered through President Moon. So upon receiving this U.S. position, how do you think North Korea should change its strategy from now?
Oh, I think that's quite clear, that the North Koreans need to be more willing to discuss true denuclearization. I think the message from the Trump administration is that you cannot be ambiguous on this point, that trying to play us along, trying to find ways to salami slice this problem isn't going to work with this administration. How Kim reacts to that, how he deals with that question, I think is the issue of the day. But I don't think President Trump could have been clearer in Hanoi. I don't think the president could have been clearer yesterday on that.
We'll leave our conversation here and now watch video for our next discussion.
Thanks.
不应该从一开始就设置过高的门槛，也不应该单方面提出不切实际的要求。
Celebrations continue marking the 70th anniversary of diplomatic ties between China and North Korea. Chairman Kim is also widely expected to visit Russia soon to hold summit with President Vladimir Putin. Is North Korea turning to its traditional allies after the breakdown of the Hanoi summit? Now, Professor Wilder, China seems very quiet on North Korea issues these days. So how is China taking the Hanoi summit breakdown?
Well, I think for the Chinese, frankly, the two key issues are no war on the peninsula, no instability on the peninsula. And denuclearization comes in a third, and frankly, a distant third in the Chinese mind. So while I'm sure they weren't happy to see the summit break down because they would like to see the negotiating process continuing, I think from their point of view, a major breakthrough is actually somewhat dangerous for their position. If Trump were to make the big deal, they always worry that this could flip the North Koreans in some way, make the North Koreans change their position in the geostrategic situation. So, frankly, I think from the Chinese point of view, this is a good place to be. They need stability on the peninsula, but they don't need major change on the peninsula. And they are in the middle of a very serious trade negotiation with the United States. That's where they need to keep their emphasis. So I don't think you're going to see them do very much right now.
Yeah, I would agree with Dennis. I think that the Chinese want to make sure that everybody knows that they cannot be excluded. But at the same time, the issues that are on the table from Singapore are actually issues that the Chinese had advocated for the U.S. and North Korea to discuss before the Singapore summit ever occurred. And so China actually stands to be the greatest beneficiary of a continued diplomatic process between the U.S. and North Korea.
And U.S. Treasury included 2 Chinese shipping companies as sanctions violators, and Japanese and British warships spot Chinese vessels engaged in ship-to-ship transfers with North Korean vessels. So when other countries are able to spot these illegal activities, how come Chinese government is not cracking down on its own vessels?
I think it's an evidence of Chinese lack of commitment to enforcement of the sanctions regime. The panel of experts report that came out provides great detail about the ways in which North Korea has been evading the sanctions regime, including issues regarding sea-based transfer of oil. And the Chinese enforcement efforts have really been absent so far. And so it's a great loophole right now in terms of North Korea getting assistance that by the UN Security Council resolutions it should not be able to receive.
And U.S. officials on many occasions say, although China is cooperating, there is more China can do on sanctions implementation. What more can China do?
Well, let's really look at the facts here. China has the largest Coast Guard in the world. It has the Chinese Navy, is the largest Asian Navy. All of this activity in smuggling, or most of it, I should say, is taking place in waters, littoral waters, very close to China. China has the ability to frustrate this effort by the North Koreans. But as Scott was saying, the latest report that came out from the U.S. government indicates that in 2018, Kim may have gotten $3.7 million barrels of oil through this smuggling operation. If that's true, that's 7.5 times what the sanctions regime says he is allowed to receive. So you have to ask, what happened to maximum pressure? And this, to me, is one of the weaknesses in the Trump policy. The difficulty of negotiating with the Chinese on a trade deal and then asking the Chinese to help on North Korea. And I think what the Chinese are clearly indicating to the administration is, if you're going to put all this pressure on us on the economic side, we're not going to exactly help you as much as you would like put the pressure on the North Koreans on the economic sanctions side. I think the Chinese are fully aware of what's going on, could do something about this, could interdict shipping, inspect more shipping, inspect the activities of their own companies, inspect the activities of their banks in this process and other commercial firms. I think that's one of the reasons the Trump administration did put on these two sanctions as sort of a shot across the bow to the Chinese. But on the other hand, the Trump administration is very unwilling to go after the major Chinese banks.
Right. And it's widely reported that Chairman Kim may visit Russia very soon to meet with President Putin. Why do you think North Korea is now reaching out to Russia as well?
I do think that an outreach to Russia makes sense for North Korea to show that it has alternatives to negotiation with the United States. Putin is a potential spoiler, really, on the Korean Peninsula. And actually, the worst case scenario would be that Putin does something with North Korea under the Trump administration, similar to what he did with Syria under the Obama administration. I think we have means to stop that. I also believe that actually the Russia-North Korea relationship is too weak to necessarily generate that kind of outcome, but it is an area that we should watch closely.
We'll end our conversation here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture of the recently held Pyongyang International Marathon. Some 950 foreigners signed up this year, almost double the number from last year. Last year, the number of foreign runners dipped after the U.S. banned Americans traveling to North Korea. Mr. Snyder, what's your reaction?
Well, Pyongyang definitely has wide avenues that would make for a wonderful marathon course, and the streets are not necessarily fully utilized. And so it's interesting that they've established this small window in terms of an annual event in Pyongyang. 954 foreigners is not that many. It does show that tourism is still an area where not Americans, but other nationals can actually go to North Korea.
You went to Pyongyang many times, right?
I've been to Pyongyang about 12 times, yes.
Wow. Mr. Wilder?
I think for the North Koreans, obviously, tourism would be one of those things that if they were to reach a deal with the United States, would be a great boon to their economy initially. If you look at, perhaps in comparison, the Chinese opening normalization, I remember in the early period of normalization, the number of Americans who wanted to see China was astounding. And I think you could get a similar effect if the North Koreans are willing to make the kinds of deals necessary.
Right.
So, this is one of the things that President Trump keeps emphasizing to Chairman Kim, is that there are a lot of openings for you. You could have hundreds of thousands of runners in North Korea. You could have exotic tourism to North Korea boom very, very quickly. And I think it just shows that right now, what they get is a very small percentage of what they could have if they would just open up and be a little more accommodating to the world.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Professor Wilder, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.